this liturgical year, we have been looking at the Gospel of Mark. Now, Mark is the first of the Gospels. And we think it was written maybe between 65 and 70. And many, when they look at this Gospel, they say, in effect, it is a passion narrative, a Gospel that is focused on the passion. And what they did, the author of Mark the evangelist, he added some public ministry before the passion, and then he added a brief scene of the empty tomb at the end of the passion. When we look at Gospels, it is not only important what the Gospel says, but it is also important where the material is placed in the Gospel. So today we have this scene of the Transfiguration, and it is strategically placed here for a very important reason. In the 8th chapter, I think it's 8:51, this is the scene where Peter is arguing with Jesus and saying, "You can't be crucified." And this is the scene where Jesus tells Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You're thinking as a man. You're not thinking as God." Why do we have this scene of the Transfiguration so central after the scene where Peter announces, "You are the Christ," and then says the Christ does not have to suffer? Well, this Transfiguration scene acts as a booster, if you will, for the Christian community for whom this gospel is being written. Now, what do I mean by a booster? You will recall that Christian persecution began in Rome under Nero in the year 64. This gospel was written in Rome. And Mark was a disciple of St. Peter. And so the church in Rome is now going through a persecution. What Mark is trying to show the people who read this gospel is that just as Jesus was going to suffer death, so too is the Christian community going to be subject to persecution. And then we have the scene of the Transfiguration. As I said, it is a booster. It's to tell the Christian community, you're going to be persecuted, but in the end, God is going to win. Because this is who Jesus is. He is the Son of God. Very clearly, on the mountain of the Transfiguration, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And so if he is God, you listen to him. And then, of course, it prepares us for the rest of the story, the passion, death, and the resurrection of the Lord himself. And so this gives the Christian community courage to continue their evangelizing efforts in the Roman Empire, and not to stop out of fear of persecution. Magnificent piece of literature. A lot of people think that, well, persecution ended with Constantine in the Roman Empire. And some people say, well, it continued throughout the 2,000-year history of the church, which it has. Millions of Christians have been persecuted throughout the history of the church. Some people say, well, it's not happening in our country, it's happening in China. And it is. And it's happening in the Middle East. And it is. And it's happening in socialist/communist countries. South America, Central America. Yes, it is. But it's also happening in our own country. Might be more subtle, might not be bloody just yet. But I am going to make a prediction. It will become bloody. The church is commissioned to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And there are efforts in this country to silence that gospel. We are living in a culture, in the midst of an ideology, in the midst of political correctness, which wants to cancel people who give any opposition to what the culture, the elite politicians are promoting. During this past week, you may have heard, I'm sure some of you have, that Congress passed what is called the Equality Act. 224 votes in favor, 206 nays. You might know what that act contains. I talked about it a little bit last week. It contains laws which would violate religious freedom, force religious institutions to hire people who are living lives contrary to what we believe as Christians regarding gospel truth. That pertains especially to those who hold a different standard for human sexuality. Also included in this bill is unlimited abortion. Because basically, if you disagree with abortion, you could be in violation of the Equality Act, which says that abortion must be legal, therefore, everyone should be in favor of it. And if you are against it, it would be a violation of the law. A violation of the law. And then finally, it talks about transgendered rights. Oh, you're not supposed to say that, but it does. It means that boys could go in girls' bathrooms. Boys could play on girls' teams. Where are the feminists now? Why aren't they yelling about that? Go ahead. Put your little girl on a football field with a couple of monster boys tackling them. How many girls are going to win in a basketball game if some boy decides he's a girl? What about track meets? Well, that doesn't matter anymore. If that boy thinks he's a girl, well, then he can play on girls' teams. It violates biology. It violates common sense. But worse than that, this transgendered ideology, LGBTQ, is being promoted in many of our educational institutions. And it has led to a tremendous amount of confusion amongst young people. And it begins at a very early age, when they're being taught, did you sometimes, if you're a boy, feel like a girl? If you're a girl, did you sometimes feel like a boy? And of course, gender is fluid. You could go back and forth and be whatever you want to be. And it's taught from a very early age. I recommend the book. Irreversible Damage. The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters by Abigail Shearer. Revocable damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters. Read this and find out what's going on in schools, in business, organizations. Find out what's being pushed on people in government offices. And many people keep their mouths shut. You know why? We live in a cancel culture. Oh, we'll cancel you. People are afraid they might lose their jobs. That's what's happening. And so they end up buying into, or at least giving lip service, that this is good. This is not good. This is evil. This past week, when this was being debated in Congress, one of the representatives from here in Florida said, this is against God's will. And Congressman Jerry Nadler from New York said, in Congress, we're not concerned about God's will. Well, truer words have not been spoken on behalf of at least the 124 that voted for the piece of legislation known as the Equality Act. Now it has to go before the Senate. What do I want you to do? Stand up like the early Christians did. All right, a lot of you might say, well, I'm old now. Doesn't make any difference. They persecute young and old in societies that are hostile to Christianity. They persecute young and old on those societies that forget about the true dignity of the human person. What can you do? First of all, begin to discuss this with your friends and relatives. Do you discuss this at home? You better. We're in trouble. Discuss what's going on. Don't say it doesn't apply to me. It does. It applies to your children. It applies to your grandchildren. Do you care about them? Book came out, just banned, When Harry Became Sally. Just banned by Amazon. Do you know that if this equality bill gets passed, that young children without parental consent, can begin transitioning therapy, taking hormone treatment? And guess where they can get it? Planned Parenthood. How do you like that? And that's just being funded all over again by the Biden administration. Planned Parenthood. And then they can even, as they grow older, decide that they want to be mutilated. And that means that they could remove their sexual organs and have them changed. And yet we know from the studies that many of them, as they mature, they identify with their biological gender, and they can, in many cases, become suicidal. That's how dangerous this is. All right, talk to each other about it. Talk to your friends. Go to your clubs, your organizations. Talk about it. Talk about it to your family. Know what the politicians believe and know what they vote. And it works. Because last week I talked about this Equality Act, and I said, last time this came up for a vote in Congress, our congressman here in the 25th District, Mario Diaz-Balart, he voted for it. And I spoke to him about it at the time. When it came up again, I wrote to him, texted him, told him, don't vote for it. I'm sure a lot of other folks did the same. His aide called me and said to me, Father, the congressman changed his mind. He read what you wrote. It makes a difference. It makes a difference. Make sure that you get in touch with the politicians. Let them know what your faith teaches, that God does make a difference. God's will does make a difference. And if they want to stay in office, They'll pay attention to what you have to say. Lastly, do not be afraid to tell people about God and his plan for humanity. Don't fall for this politically correct nonsense and believe that human beings can take the place of God and redesign humanity according to whatever way they feel. Talk about God's plan for humanity, how God created us male and female, how God calls us to proclaim the truth of Jesus Christ, the message of the gospel, which talks about the dignity of every human person and that we should never be bullied into believing things and doing things which are contrary to common sense and to biblical principles. Let's take one more quote from Scripture. It's the last of the Beatitudes. Blessed are you when you are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, and when men speak every kind of calumny against you. Be glad and rejoice, for your reward will be great in heaven. God love you.